What's up, y'all? This is Jesse Warden. Today I wanted to talk about scope in Lua and a little bit about JavaScript as well. Specifically, we're doing Corona SDK work, but it can apply to any Lua environment you're running in, as well as JavaScript. So I get this question a lot on the forums. I see it on the forums. I wish there was some kind of definitive guide that really explained the way it should be done. There's also a lot of concepts about scope in Corona and Lua that are based on somebody's preference of how they code. So it's very difficult to say this is the right way, but there are some facilities that Lua has that other languages don't that make dealing with scope easy. And I thought that if I showed some of those and the way you would normally develop things in Corona SDK, it makes it a lot easier and approachable, so you feel more confident rather than having to memorize every weird way that Corona does scope. So let's take a sample project here, and I'm going to save a new project just to show you. Let's say testing. Say Lua scope code. And hopefully at the end of this video today, you'll understand, okay, this is what scope means. This is how my functions and tables in Lua operate in different conditions when they're called with different functions. And this is some of the workarounds that I can use to get scope if I don't want to deal with it. It's very difficult to sometimes object pool a lot of these things as well. So if you're a gamer, concerned with performance and event listers and things like that, this is something to take note of. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about Lua is that it is table-based or object-based. If you know anything about ECMAScript, same thing with JavaScript, is that it deals with basically objects that have properties on them or slots. So if you're a C guy, it's basically a struct that is dynamic. Everything's a variant. The only things that are slightly different is that the actual structs, the variants, don't have to be declared ahead of time. So you don't have to declare any data types, you don't have to pre-allocate arrays or things like that. You just write it and it just works. So this has flexibility but also problems. And everything defaults to nil, which is NIL, not null like in JavaScript. So it's something to be aware of, that you can create anything you want, and those values, doesn't matter what you call them, they have certain names, right? Additionally, it doesn't have a prototype chain like JavaScript. So by default, most objects don't have a default prototype. In Lua's case, it's called a metatable, which is kind of like a prototype. So it's like if I can't find a property on this object, maybe it's what it inherited from or extended or had a prototype of, right? Lua is very similar like that. And you can actually make prototypes in Lua if you wanted. But at the end of the day, we're just dealing with this little thing here called a table. I'm going to start with T. That's a table, right? So if you print out T and you want to see what it looks like, you'll say table and give you the memory address. So this is the default object we're dealing with. The other default object we're dealing with in Corona is something called a function, and it looks something like that. So tables and functions are the most things you're actually going to deal with. Keep in mind, if you're like from a C background or something else, or typed language, that Lua is untyped. And you can actually show the type of the language, which is like type T, type, let's print it out, I'll show you. Print the type of T, print the type of F. There we go. Yeah, I hear you. There we go. So the actual, yes, I know, thank you. Then end. There we go. End. Excuse me, princess. Okay, so the table and function, they print out the types of table and function. Keep in mind that strings and numbers, and we only have one number type in Lua, it's a float. Strings and numbers are by val. So if you make a reference to them, you're actually getting a brand new unique instance of it, like a copy, so to speak. It's a real true copy. Whereas tables and functions are by val. So if you create references, you're really just creating a pointer to it, right? And you can give it all pointers. And Lua is a garbage collected language, which does reference counting, so you are somewhat responsible for cleaning up those references. I don't know how they handle abandoned objects, which have circular references to themselves, but no one else outside of it, and that's what the market supers for, so don't know yet, but whatever. All you need to know is that tables and functions are the primary way of actually building things, of dealing with scope. So when people say, I don't understand what my scope is, that's what they're talking about. So when you write code in Lua, you're in some, it doesn't matter if you're in Corona or Moi or Gideros or whatever else, you're running in some particular global space, right? Now, most people have one. You can create multiples in Lua, but for the most part, we have a G. It's like, you know, underscore G, which stands for global. So if we say print G, we'll actually get a table. And that table that we're on is the global space. So anytime you create something, by default, it goes there. If you import modules, it'll actually put it in a special kind of module place. But if you create modules without the module tag, it'll shove it up on global, right? It'll create this global object, which is what? A table. So when I say object, I mean table. Same thing, okay? So that's cool and all, but you know, what are the levels of scope? PHP handles it differently than Java and everything else. So when you want to call a function, the function itself is something like this. So we'll say, let's change our other function to be a function f. We'll say hello. Okay. Now, it treats it a lot. If you're familiar with JavaScript, you're familiar with closures, right? Functions themselves have some form of scope and access to the context in which they're defined, also known as a closure, right? But they also know about other things like globals. They can access just about anything unless it's redefined. Now, the difference between Lua and JavaScript is that JavaScript doesn't have block scoping. So you can define a var anywhere, and as long as you don't go var blah, you can access it. Whereas Lua, the deeper you nest things with local, it's in that particular scope. It's kind of like indents, right? So just something to be aware of, that you can, if you know JavaScript and no closures there, you can take all that knowledge and move it to Lua. But the challenge here is, what is self? Like, what am I? So we can print global inside of a global function, right? And it'll give us global there as well. Let's actually execute it, Jesse. How about that? There we go. Sorry, invoke it. So hello, right? And then it gives us a table of G. So we can also access other global objects outside of it, such as message, which is a global object. So we can say print message, right? And you can actually grab those global variables from within the function. So the function has access to all those things as well. Additionally, it's the whole concept of block scope, where I say message here is cow. Then I print it, notice it changed to cow. It's going to reference the local one first, right? And this is blocked scope to that, okay? So to give you another example, we can say local cheese, define a function within a function. This will blow your mind. Going all Inception style in Lua. So we'll say print message, right? And we'll say local message equals holy fish, holy fish, right? Outside message, inside message, right? So let's invoke that guy. So you can see the inside message is holy fish, right? They're all messages. You can see 3 of them. But the outside message, which actually executes down here, is that. And notice that this is local, so it's only inside this function, okay? So that scope of variables that you define with local are contained. And that's the key first thing you got to know, is when you say local, you're creating that variable, that function, that table, whatever, local to where it's defined. Think indent. When I say where, think indent, okay? So indent is inside of this cheese function, or indent is inside of this x function, or indent is non-existent, which means it's global because there's no local. Now, what is the difference on global and local? This is a special case. I was going to cover this later, but I'll cover it now. So what's the difference between this and this? Print message, print G message. That's the difference. Did you see that? Did you catch that? So notice the first one I printed was message, right? That's a local variable within this defined scope, okay? This one, the first one, this, doesn't have a actual local variable, so it's automatically defined on the global scope. So if you don't put local, it's automatically put on G, right? If you don't use the word local, that variable or function or table or whatever is put on G. So that is the difference at the global scope thing, okay? So for the most part, you're always going to use local. Me and my so far games I've been trying to do the past 2 years, the only things I ever put on global are a game loop, because why would you not have a game loop in a game? Number 2 is main group. It is the main group or main display group that you have in Corona. Most box 2D engines, unless you're dealing with Unity, because Unity's the bomb, if you're dealing with most box 2D engines, they don't like when you mess with their world space, when you move things around. Corona made box 2D Engaderos and parts of Moi made it really simple, where you can take any display object and make it a body, right? A physics body. But if you have those physics objects in a group and you move the group, the physics coordinates are here and you move the group over here. Totally messes it up. So to keep things organized, where I can put GUI on top and GUI behind, I always have a default main group to put all my game objects in, and then I can put GUI on top. Similar to layers in Moi, if you're familiar with that, or a new layer, Z-depth in Flash, if you're familiar with that, okay? So these are the only real two things I always define in globals. Now, how do you define globals? Well, you could define it like that. You could also go set up globals. And we'll say message is a global message, right? And let's say print G message after we run setup globals. Okay, and as you can see, G message got it. So it doesn't matter where you actually define it. You could define it like deeply nested in some Uber inception function. Uber inception function. Holy fish! How long can we make? All right, that's enough. You get the point. Cut, paste. Oh, gotta correct the eye. Gotta be good camel case. See, so it doesn't matter where you define it. As soon as you don't use global, it's always going to be global. So this is what, if you're not used to dealing with global variables and understand the power, this is a lazy thing some people do because they don't understand scopes. Well, now you understand it, okay? So globals are very powerful, but they overwrite everything you do. So if I were to do local down here with cheese, right, but I accidentally forward referenced it, not cheese, you idiot, message. So if I said print message, and then I did it right below it, I should get nil, right? And that's the problem, is that if you, there you go, see, a global message and then nil. If you actually define forward reference variables like that, it's not good. That's why a lot of times you'll see some of us programmers from an OOP background, if we're making classes or something, or constants, we'll kind of define all that stuff up here, even if it's something like this, like message, or first name, or game started, let's say false. We're just defining them up top so everyone knows, and if it's in a class or a closure class, which I'll show in a minute, it's like that, right? So that's the concept of local and everything else in global, is that where you define it's important, when you define it's important, and how deeply nested isn't really important with globals. You got it? Okay, cool. If not, you're like, dude, slow down. Well, you can hit pause really fast and I'll, okay? So let's talk about classes or closures. Actually, you know what? Let's back up. Let's talk about event listeners first. The most common thing you do in Corona and Lua is you talk about event listeners, right? You talk about, I want to know when a transition is done, or I want to know when a user touched this thing, or that's gross. I want to know when a user had an interframe event and I need to move something based on an interframe event. So it's not a user's runtime thing, right? So event listeners. This is the common thing about Corona. Event listeners have the same problem that they have in Flash, and that is you cannot object pool events, right? You can object pool the actual event object, but you can't actually object pool the actual handler per se. So when you're actually dispatching your own common things, it's very difficult to actually object pool those, but I'll explain that in a minute. So let's, it's a little easier in Lua actually in Corona, but anyway, so let's do an example. Let's say you want to know when somebody touched a circle. So we'll go local circle, new circle, let's say 30 by 30, make it minimum 60 pixels. Once you make it smaller than that, Android devices go, what? I don't know what a touch is. iOS is like, I got you twice on Sundays. Very frustrating. Set color, set it red. I like it red. And let's do a, yeah, I know, it's called circle. Thanks. Let's do 0, 0 and move it. Circle. It's not stroke color, it's fill color, bro. And this is why Sublime needs some work with its code hands. Just a little bit. All right, let's go to 30. 30. All right, check it out. I hate that it doesn't do that. Copy. All right. Let's go down to 100. All right. So the way it works is you have a global touch event or a local touch event. We're usually concerned with local touch events. I want to know when you clicked on that button. I want to know when the user clicked on that sprite. I want to know when the user clicked on that menu button in the greater list of menu buttons, right? So we're going to add a local event handler or touch handler. So we'll go circle.addEventListener, touch, and untouched circle. Okay, we're gonna make it up. Now, Lua runs like from top to bottom. It's not like unless it's in a function. So since this code is run line by line, let's define the function first before we actually reference it. Now you don't have to put event in here, but I'm gonna do it anyway just to be a nice person. And we'll say print touched. Okay. So watch what happens. So we're gonna say touch the circle, and it gets two events. It gets began when you press, and ended when you let go, and sometimes canceled if you like drag it off. Okay. So we can actually print out that phase if you'd like to see why it's getting multiple touch events. So we'll say phase. Okay. Press began, let go ended, press began, moved because I'm moving my mouse, and I drag outside the circle and let go. Okay. So sometimes you get canceled, sometimes not. It just depends on focus and stuff like that. So that's cool, but is there any way to know, other stuff? Well, the only way to reference other variables is via globals, right? Or local globals. So for example, even though circle is on local up here, it's local to this particular scope called stage. What I can do is I can say print circle touched circle. And it'll give us the exact same circle instance we just created, right? There we go. Okay, circle touch, right? Same circle. What if I have multiple objects on the screen and I'm trying to deal with touched, okay? Well, let's do that. By the way, you can also do local, doesn't matter. That way this touch circle will only be on the one scope, it won't actually be on the G object. Works just the same, okay? However, let's say we want to have multiple circles and we wanted to know which one I touched. Well, let's get a unique name. Now, again, objects, tables in Lua are very similar to objects in JavaScript, which means they are the opposite of immutable. It means you can put whatever you want on them. They're all variants. Doesn't matter. There's no such thing as like, you can't put that property. It doesn't exist. Well, it does now. So first, circle. Copy pasta. We'll say circle 2. Put this guy at about 300 and make him blue. Just kidding. Make him green. Second. Okay. Looks like a stoplight. Do I go or do I stop? Do I stay or do I go? Oh, that was a cheap joke. All right. So say touched. So we'll share function pointers, right? And we'll say circle, addEventListener, touch, and we'll say touched. And we'll do the same thing for circle 2. Now, the way you know what was clicked on or who generated the event is a very common convention in most, like 90% of all event handlers in Corona, that you're dealing with objects or display objects. A display object is basically anything you see on the screen, right? Anytime you're dealing with that scope, it's an event.target. Who generated the message, okay? So we know that our circles have a name property, so we'll trace that out. Ready? First circle I click on, and second circle I click on, okay? So that's how you differentiate, right? Well, what if you want different behavior on different circles? Well, let's talk about that. We can use something called a table listener. So let's show how. Let's just say T. I do this all the time because I'm lazy. You're not supposed to use single letter variable names because finding replaces is very difficult. This is a bad practice, but I'm doing it anyway because no one can stop me from doing bad practice and post it on YouTube. All right, so we're gonna print this out. Say print T. Now tables have this cool property called self. Okay, so let's print that out. Print. Okay, so you can add a table listener, and let's only do this on so we don't have to see 20 billion messages. Okay, so as you can see, the memory address is the exact same, which means T, aka the function referencing itself way up here, the function closure. See how the T's highlighted all 3 places? T and self are the exact same thing, right? This is a neat function that functions have when you define them like this, right? When you have this little colon here. And I'm going to explain this about 3 times. So if you don't get it off the top of the head, off the bat, don't worry about it, okay? So we can use table listeners or we can use functions. The reason tables are nice is that tables have a unique ability to work with events in Corona or in Lua specifically. So for example, you'll notice that I passed a table as the event handler's function. So instead of a function, I said, here, use this table instead. How does it know to call the touch function? How does it know? Well, this is kind of like something that's built in. If you're listening for touch, it's going to go look for the touch function on that table. If it doesn't find it, it won't do anything. It'll just break. You won't get any error or anything. It'll just break. Really helpful. It'd be nice if the runtime actually said, I can't find this function. You're silly. But it doesn't do that. So just something to be aware of. It's a silent failure, and you're like, what did I do wrong? So that's why I always go copy, paste. Or if you're in Sublime, you can highlight and go, okay, they're both highlighted in white. I must have spelled it correctly. Since spelling errors are the most problematic things in Lua. Okay? So it knows to do that, right? Now, you don't have to really care about self right now. You can just say, okay, I don't even have to use self. I don't even have to use table. I can say event.target.x. I'm sorry, name. We'll do something a little funky here. If we click on the red one, it's going to go right. If we click on the green one, it's going to go left, okay? If the name equals first circle, then event.target.x equals event.target.x plus 4. Else, for now we only have 2 circles. Okay. See? So it knows it's the red one. It's going to go right. And this one's going to go left. So that's how we can get specifically who you clicked on. But there's another way to do that without having to reference various targets by some magic string. You can also do locally scoped things. Now, what does that mean? Well, display objects, circles, bodies, rectangles, display objects, sprite sheets, they're all display objects. They're also tables, right? So they follow the exact same rules. So let's destroy all this. Let's go like this. Function circle. I thought it was cool. Now I'm cool. Touch. Don't even need the event for this. Watch this. Self.x equals self.x plus 4. Circle 2. Self.x equals self.x minus 4. Okay, makes sense. So instead of T, we're going to say circle. Instead of T, we're going to say circle 2. So check this syntax out. Add an event listener to the circle and call myself, aka look for the touch event handler on myself. So when I hear touch on myself, I want you to call myself. You got it? Okay. All right. Now, why is this better than a table? Why is this better than a function? Well, as your application grows, you tend to get a lot of code. And when you get a lot of code, the biggest challenge is, where do I put all this code? Because sometimes it's not valid. Like, it's like not invalid code. Like, I know I need this code. This code manages movement. This code manages scores. This code manages saving the game. What do I do with all this code? Well, you've got to learn how to grow it. And you don't have to automatically put it in these places in the beginning. It's quite all right to spread it all out and then organize it later and put in the classes and put in the functions and put in local things. But you need to know the cost of, like, okay, do I do local event handlers and everything else and the scope and everything else? So when you get all this code, you know where to go, right? And scope is a part of that. Dealing, and this is kind of like what I'm getting at with self eventually. Self allows you to make your functions a little bit more portable. Now you can still reference, and see how I did self here? I can still go like this, right? I can still go circle. And there's a lot of people who do this. They say, yeah, I don't care about scope, self is dumb, I don't need it, I can just, you know, it's a global object, or even it's a local object and a module. Like, why would I need to use self? I don't need to, it works fine. And as you can see, it works just fine. But self allows you to copy and paste that function into other classes or other modules, other places. And as soon as you define what self is, it just works. You don't have to, like, oh yeah, it's not a circle, it's a box in this class. Like, you don't have to rename it, right? So it's a little more portable, a little more, it's, you know, the small parts of OOP, object-oriented design, right? So that's the concept of, okay, I can use a table listener, I can use a regular table, I could actually use a display object as it, and I could just, you know, go back to using regular functions, whether they're local or global, right? So you kind of see all different ways of defining that. Now, let's talk about how is it that we define functions without this colon thing. What does it do exactly? Okay, so I'm just going to make it the function a normal property. Okay, the syntax is fine. It doesn't matter. You know, Lua doesn't mind if you do it like that, or if you do it like that, right? As an what we call in the JavaScript world an anonymous function, right? Works, right? They both work. Doesn't matter. You know, doesn't matter, right? Each way. The difference is, watch this. Self. I'm watching Jesse. I'm watching Jesse. I'm not done. Now I'm done. So when you click, I have no idea of self. I don't know who I am. Now, what does self really mean? Self means who am I? But how is that helpful? Well, a lot of times you're going to create something called an instance of a class, right? You're going to create the same circle. Like, let's say you're creating a bubble pop game, and a bunch of bubbles go across the screen, and your goal is to click as many as possible, but only the ones that are of a certain color, right? So the way that works is you're going to create a template, and it's going to call a circle, and it's going to have, you know, knowledge of how to move across the screen. And when somebody touches on it, it's going to say, hey, dispatched event, somebody touched on me, and by the way, my color is this, right? So some game object can manage, okay, you clicked on the red ones, you get points, you click on the green ones, you don't get points, right? That is a single class, and you just create instances of it, or new. Just like we don't create like a brand new, you know, circle each time. We actually just say new circle, pass in some parameters, how big it is. And if we want to change its color, great. If you want to add its name, great. If you want to move it, great. But they're all from the exact same class, right? This class, or display new circle, has all that behavior nested inside of it, and then we just create multiple instances of it. In this case, two, a red one and a green one, right? So when you create your own classes, sometimes they're inheritance or composition, they wrap a circle and you give it kind of certain features, right? The feature we just gave these are when you click them, they move. But you can make it, you click it, they explode, or they play a different sprite sheet, or they play a sound. Whatever that is, it's a little bit easier to do self. Now, there's some examples on the Lua page, Lua users guide, or Lua wiki, whatever, where they have like 3 different ways to do those type of classes, and the performance implications between each is like so minute you don't even care. So if you want to do the dot way, referencing this, or you want to do the colon way and reference self, right? Like we're talking like 2 milliseconds for like a pretty sizable function. It's ridiculous. Like, you know what I mean? There's not really a lot of difference. So that's basically the concept of that. Okay. So let's create a set of modules and show you what happens when we start dealing with multiple classes, lots more code, and we have some challenges of, okay, who's got scope and where, okay? So before I do that, let me show you a challenging one. And this is a transition. And this one's tricky, okay? This is a little different than what we're used to. So we'll go transition to circle 1. Just kidding, circle. We'll say time takes 1 second to make its Y go to 500, okay? Now watch this. On complete equals circle. And we'll say circle on complete, the tween, and actually it's tween ID really, user data, and we'll say circle dot Y equals 2. So when it's done going down the screen, it's gonna hop back up to the top, okay? Now watch this. Not to the back of the screen. Sorry, let's try not X, but Y. There we go. Boom. See how that happened? It knows to call this. You could just as simply go on complete and then put on complete down there and it'll call the function as well. But the key here is that you can put tables in there and do that. You can also do a function closure, such as function E, circle on complete, past the event, end, right? Boom, it's another way to do it. The problem with doing things like this is that this is a one-time use function created one time, and it's also defined in a particular scope that eventually the garbage collector is going to have to, destroy. And if you run this multiple times, you're creating multiple functions. All right, so quick recap. We've understood the difference between this message, hey, that's global. The message this is local to whatever scope you're finding in, whether you're in a function or whether you're on the root, also known as stage. And if you want to access anything that is on the global to compare, you can say _G to properly reference what are globals versus just message equals message, right? And this will actually reference the separate one. See, they're not the same because one is local and it's nil, the other one's not. Okay, we've also learned that the difference between this cow print moo and local function cow print moo is the same as the table, and that is one is defined here, say oh my god cow, and one zone global, right? First one, cow, is the local function, and the global one is actually referenced on G. Make sense? You got it? So the rules of functions, because they almost act like tables, are very similar to tables in terms of whether you use local in front of them or not. Now keep in mind, you can also do this. Cheese. And it does the same thing. As you can see, it's cheese. It overwrote the original, which is local, right? So this and this are the same. This is now dead and destroyed, and this one is now birthed. Birthing. It's birthing. It's alive. All right. So that's the general concept of scope, and black scoping rules come into play when you have locals within locals within locals, right? It's all about tabs. So let's make ourselves a misogable. We'll go my balloon. Let's say my circle. Makes it a little simpler. My circle. So we're going to create a table. Notice I capitalized it. I capitalized it because it's an actual class, right? It's not a real class if you're familiar with class definitions. So if you come from a language that actually has classes, you know, you dream of a day when JavaScript developers will actually think classes are worth it versus using CoffeeScript and TypeScript, blah, blah, blah. So this is the convention I use. Some people do it differently. That's okay. Here's the point. Notice I don't have that weird module CL crud at the top, okay? Local circle is display new circle. Now, just because we're making a module, the same rules apply, okay? Let's talk about that. What does that mean, Jesse? When I reference this module, no one can get to this. It's called a private variable, right? It means no one from the outside of the module can get in and snag that circle, okay? Because the circle is the instance you're actually getting back. So I'll show you what that means. So let's go function circle touch. We'll say transition to self or circle. You can do either one. Both is fine. I'm going to do self because I'm from an OOPA language background, and these 10 years of habits are hard to break. I quit smoking, but I can't quit using self. Crazy. Self time is 500 milliseconds. And the alpha goes to 0. And the on complete is self. Okay? So when I click on it, it will fade out. And find it's on complete. I don't care about the event. Is self.remove self. That's not unreadable or anything. Self.remove self. Remove myself from myself. Automatopoeia, or is that hyperbole? I always get those two confused. All right. Last but not least, you can do this in two ways. You can put code in your constructor. Constructor is this thing right here. Constructor means make my class instance, right? I call it new. The function name's new, but it's really called a constructor in computer science terms, I guess. So you can put it in the constructor, or you can create an init method. Sometimes init methods are nice because they allow you to create the class and then test the construction of the class. They allow you to organize things as the code gets crazy. Because after a while, you're starting to notice your classes will get really big. Like this one's only about like 28 lines because I had tons of white space. But after a while, the code will get really big, lots of functions. So you want to kind of put all the initialization into an init. And the other good thing about an init is you can't call a constructor twice. But an init method, you can call multiple times, okay? So what we'll do is we'll put, for now, we're not going to make an init method. We'll just go circle dot add event listener touch circle, not self. Self in this case applies to my circle. That's right. You getting it? You following it? Now notice I don't have a local function around this thing. Why is that? Well, I'll show you. Let's go print my circle, which is a global class definition, and it's no. Now let's require it. Wait, let's undo that. And require it. We'll go my circle. And as you can see, it'll give me errors for syntax, which we'll go fix right quick. Not telling you it doesn't like my circle. Well, it's return, silly. Where's you learn the code? There you go. It's a table. It's a class definition table. Now, that is the same thing as what? My circle. Right? All I did was create a global table. And if you do not use that module stuff at the very top, like the module, CL, blah, 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 you'll see that in unit test. Actually, in case you're wondering, what is he talking about, dude? Like, for real? Like, he seems to know all this crap? I'll show you. Let's go to test main and go to read file constant service. There it is. See this module package CL? So the first time you import it, I believe it returns a true from the require. Every other time it'll actually return the object itself. Or maybe that, no, I think it's backwards. First time it'll give you the module reference. This is why you sometimes see people, when they're dealing with physics, they'll go stuff like this. They'll go, I gave you a Lua library. Please use it like so. Physics equals require physics. You know what I'm saying? Because they actually return the module. And then if you run this twice, like if I went like this, the first time it would be the physics. The second time it would actually be a boolean of true. What? I know, it's like really stupid. So I don't use that module thing. It doesn't make any sense. And your class always gets defined on global when you do it like that, right? So here's the key. If I want to get a circle, I'll go my circle new. Now it's a little different than display.newCircle, but you start to learn the syntax. Constructor new, right? Or class new. If you're from VB, this should look really familiar, I guess. You can see the circles over there, top left. Okay. So here's the key. We can still take it and treat it like a normal display object. Right? It's just a wrapper, or it's a wrapper around that object of circle. We just add stuff called the decorator pattern. We added stuff and then returned it. So it's kind of like composition and decorator combined. If you don't know what those are, they're design patterns. Go look them up on Google. There's probably tons of YouTube videos for that as well. So that is a simple class. Now, as you can see, again, it's on G, G. It's defined up there, right? The G. Now let's do this. Let's make this local. As you can see, if we make it local, no one from the outside world can touch it, right? And it also it doesn't like when you actually define it in that syntax. So, right, it wants that particular one to be like that. So we could go, what's another example we could do? We could do new, right? Still works. The difference between this is that if you ever want to deal with static variables, if you don't know what static variables are variables that are defined once in the class, not unique per instance. So for example, this is an instance or member variable called name. My name. Okay. So we'll create multiple circles. We'll say circle 1, local circle 2, my circle, circle 2, say 300. Cool. Okay. Print circle name. Okay. Print them both. Now you can see they have. I'll explain why that's same table in a minute. Okay. Just bear with me. So circle 1, circle 2. These are called instance variables. So you have a class or template. Everybody has a name, and you just set it when you pass it into the constructor, something brand new every single time, right? In this case, we're saying circle 1 is his name, circle 2 is his name, right? So they all reference the same template, right? They all have the same name variable. It's just a different value. Each instance is unique, right? So you and I are extended from the same person template. It just so happens that I'm Jesse and you are awesome, right? Makes sense, right? We all have unique, variables and everything else, but we all, have 2 arms, 2 legs usually sometimes, and we all have certain characteristics that are similar. It's just they different, right? I have long hair. Next week it will be gone. Right, things like that. Okay, static is things that are the same for the template. So, for example, that'll never change. Let's say my circle, death is assured. Right, true. Everyone is going to die. There aren't people where you can say like this. You can't go will die, and then it defaults to true, but somehow you find a way to reverse that through science. Right, that's not. No, we all die eventually. Science someday will fix that, but not in our generation, right? So that's a static variable. Okay, if you didn't have this, you couldn't actually reference it. So let's show an example of that. Let's say print self dot death is assured. Death is assured true, right? It is true for every single class, right? It's not unique. There's one copy of this variable in RAM on that particular table, which is my circle, right? There's 2 variables of my name for each variable circle, right? There's 2 actual pointers and allocations in RAM for that, right? So memory is different. This is, if we have 50 classes, 50 circles, we still only have 1 variable called death is assured in RAM, right? So that's what statics are powerful for. Since there's no such thing as classes in Lua and there's no such thing as statics in Lua, this is basically a static. Okay, you just shove it on a class closure or whatever and call it a day. You can do the same thing with metatables, but the point is that if you didn't have self, you couldn't actually reference that particular thing inside the function unless you did what? I'll let you guess before I tell you the answer. That's right, reference my circle. So you can see how it says, can't find it. There's no such thing as self, right? Well, how do we fix that? We fix it by that, right? See, that's sure true. Okay, so why is my name, now we go to the next thing. Make sense? Static. So why is the name, now you understand statics, a table? Watch this. Huh? Right? Why did it do that? When you do not define this and you call it, when you invoke a function like this, even with these two little dots, but you don't define it like that, you define it with the dot, it assumes that you're going to give it some form of scope, right? You're going to say, what is my scope? So just because a function is on my circle doesn't mean that it has to point to my circle for self, right? This is the whole point of functional languages, that functions can have scopes attached to anything and allows you to do really crazy cool things with AI and recursion and blah, blah, blah. The rest of us are just trying to do our day jobs and make cool things, right? So we don't really care about that. We care about, okay, scope, contained code, encapsulated code, right? Things like that. So a lot of times you can actually pass the scope. Now, what does that mean? I will pass the scope. I will go like this. My circle new, and I will say the scope is my circle, right? And there you go. It's the same thing, still works, right? And I can say scope is my circle, right? Right? I mean, like, for real, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, are you picking up what I'm putting down? Circle. True. Okay? So scope is my circle, true. Now, why did I not have to do that with the colon? The colon does that first argument for you. Okay? So it automatically implicitly passes that as the first argument and sets a scope for you. That's why you see one argument here, but you count two here. Okay? And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the magic of colon. Other languages like JavaScript do not do that. They require two things to require that to happen. Let me show you. I'll give you a backbone router example, which is a JavaScript project I've done on GitHub. Just show the basics of dealing with routers and things like that. Okay. What I wanted to show you was the scope. Now this is a closure-based class. Okay. So scope in here is when I say this, right? It's actually applying to this particular object right here called basic router. So these functions, any variables I define up here, that's what this is, right? Usually you can't do that. You have to use something called underscores bind to do that. And I'll show you an example of that. Okay, so you can see this bind function right here has the ability to say, this is the function, this is who I'm referring to, please return me and call me with that particular scope. If you don't know what function.call or function.apply are in JavaScript, they're very similar to the colon in Lua, but they're a little more powerful. You can actually change the scope of what a function's called. You can pass it arguments in order or as an array. So I really wish Lua had that. But anyway, so this bind function allows you to make sure that functions are always called with this. Same thing as self in Lua, right? Because they don't have colon. They don't have a way to say, call this function with this particular scope. So regardless of how the function is invoked in JavaScript, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. It's all about, okay, where, you know, who's calling me and how, not how I'm defined. Lua is both how it's defined and how it's called. If you use a colon when you define it, it's automatically going to get that scope. Self is going to be good to go. If you don't care about self, you can ignore the past 5 minutes of this video. Okay? If you want to do the old way where you just define, like, I just want to reference circle and everything. This self thing is dumb, dude. Cool. Sorry to waste your time. You can definitely do that. Okay? But now you know the differences, and it's important. Now, let's talk about dynamic calling to that kind of stuff. I'm gonna clean up this class a little bit. Oh yeah, by the way, so this is how CoffeeScript generates it. If you're curious, you can go to underscore the website and go to bind, There it is. You can also bind and say, hey, call this function with this particular scope. So I'll do like this.on or object prototype, this.on with a comment of this. So it always calls your response handler, like when you click it or you call it elsewhere with this particular scope, right? So you can do bind if you're using just raw JavaScript, or you can use CoffeeScript and TypeScript, which will do it for you, right? It'll generate that bind call that you saw. Okay? Make sense? Okay, so that is that. Now, how do I reference things from outside this circle? Well, you'll notice that it's removing itself, right? So as soon as I click it, right, it'll fade out and go away. And just on another, you can also do display.remove. It's another way to get objects. I always like to do it like circle.remove self or whatever, right? Okay, make sense? All right, so that is that particular OOP stuff in a nutshell. Let's do something a little different. So how do you access global objects or create new things inside of yourself, right? There's two ways. If you have a global object, let's say, I don't know, score. If I define it, I can definitely see what the current score is. So I can print it out. I can reference global variables within there. So because it's score, it's the same thing as doing G, right? Right. Now, as soon as I hide that, like creating my own score here, or I do a local variable score, that score is going to be very different. Okay, makes sense? So that's the scope change that's going to happen there. So for the most part, the only two global variables I ever really reference, well, three, is game loop, main group, or stage. Right, now you can do display.stage or get display current stage depending on what build of Corona you got. But I don't like typing those stupid functions when I'm going to use them everywhere. It's a very common thing to do, so why wouldn't I, right? Plus, the lookup for a global is pretty fast because it goes G right there, right? Pretty fast. All right, what else? So that's globals. Let's talk about why are none of these functions local? Well, okay, we can talk about that. Print circle self. So it doesn't like that syntax when you do a local function. It's already known that when you do this particular function with the scope of touch, like aka the colon, it's gonna be it's gonna be local right there, right? It doesn't like that particular syntax. So if you wanted to do a dot, you still can't really get away with it. It doesn't like you to define it like that. If you're gonna do local like that, then why should you do it like this? But guess what? It's now your responsibility when you call this particular circle to define it like that. Also, circles are already local, so you can't really define a function. So if you wanted to do local touch and then just reference circle, print circle.name, you could definitely do that, right? And we'll just say touch instead of circle, right? That kind of defeats the purpose of OOP, right? I have to manually pass in self, and then I'm referencing global objects. So at this point, the speed differences aren't large. Whatever you feel more comfortable with, that's fine. I've generally seen the rules are whatever you do, it needs to be consistent, right? If anybody's going to read your code, including yourself 6 months later, as long as it's consistent throughout this large code base, you have a chance in heck of actually understanding how it works, right? So it doesn't matter what style you choose, because Lua doesn't have kind of a class-based system anyway. So you need to pick it. Whatever it is, makes you happy, right? But I encourage you not to use globals. You should try to use local and core scope functions as much as possible. And the fact that Lua has colon, it's a wonderful feature to retain scope. You should take advantage of that. Okay? Make sure your class is more encapsulated, makes moving code around easier. And that's just my humble opinion, which isn't really humble. I feel strongly about it. Okay? So that's the mains of scope. Let's see what else. What else? Ah, yes, dispatching events. Let's talk about that. So, if you want to dispatch events, I'm going to go self.dispatch. Now, why do I have this function here? Why do I have dispatch event? The reason I have dispatch event is because I extend a display object. All display objects, if you extend it or wrap it with composition, all display objects in Corona have a dispatch event function. And all you have to pass is a table with a name. So, untouched circle. Now, why would I redispatch an event? It has some advantages. I'll show you. What happens if I go like this? I go circle, add event listener, touch, and I go self, and then I go circle 2, touch, self. Now, when I create a function called touch, I've got to immediately differentiate. And since Lua doesn't have switch statements, I gotta go if e.target equals circle, then blah, 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 right? Fine. But what if I also have a menu in the same class? I have a menu object. So let's say it's a local rect, or no, let's just do text. Local text, say field, display new text, and we say, so save, like save game, right? Say 50, I think it was native font or system font. Yeah, native system font. Font size 21, right? And then we say field.add listener, touch field. You'll start to see that these table listeners at first seem kind of neat because you can like always say like just call a function over there. You don't have to name the function. The table has scope, right? But then certain bad things start to happen. Your touch function gets out of control because now it's dealing with circle touches and menu touches, and it's sharing logic with the game as well as the GUI and blah, right? It gets a little crazy. But now I don't have to do that. Why not, Jesse? Because I have custom events for my circles, and they only care if you actually clicked on it, not if it began, right? So it significantly reduces the amount of events, and I return true for focus reasons. If you want to know why this is important, go look it up. This is a convention you should follow. Okay, so now this can deal with menu logic. This custom event can deal with game logic. Make sense? And that is why you do self-dispatching events that are custom. You can make out whatever you want. Now here's the challenge you're going to have with custom events. Sometimes somebody doesn't have a reference to circle. Let's say you're making a score manager. Score manager is some global class that deals with adding points and saving to the local phone or some cloud service. Does the score like model class have to have a reference to every single circle to know when you touched it, or is somebody else going to have to reference and forward those messages? Royal pain, right? This is where the global event bus in Corona comes in. So let's show you what the global event bus is. So we can do runtime. Now what's the difference between runtime itself? It's very similar to global physics operations versus local physics operations. I only want to know when this particular ball hits something else versus I want to know when anything, anywhere hits something. Make sense? I want to know when a circle was touched anywhere. I don't care where it's from, right? So notice how I don't care which circle. I can just do it one time. Now notice the difference is that I now am responsible for passing the target, so the event has a chance to understand who did it. I could do self, I could, not event that self. I could do self or I could do circle, right? It doesn't matter. I'm going to do self because I'm a self kind of guy. So I can go runtime. You also notice I have 1 listener versus 50 for 50 circles. It's another neat thing, right? However, you'll quickly run into a problem with that. Untouched circle. e.target.name. Now the one problem you'll have with that, you notice how I hit two or 1, is that you start to run into name collisions. What if somebody else said untouched or somebody else said uncircle touched, right? The convention you can follow is very similar to how the backbone people do it, but without colons. You can say my circle untouched. This has 2 advantages. Number 1 is it allows your circle to have multiple events. You have my circle underscore, on circle touched, on circle thrown, on circle hit something, right? So you can have a bunch of events and you immediately know where they are. They're from the my circle class and this is the event, right? Additionally, you can guarantee you have name collisions that won't happen because my circle will only dispatch these events. Your other class is going to have a completely different class name, thus it's not going to dispatch. Even if it has on circle touched as the event, it'll be like my other class underscore, right? Always different. So you don't have to use package names, but you could also do that as well, like com underscore Jesse Warden underscore views versus sprites, right? So there's a variety of ways to do it. But don't do that off the get-go. Even though these kind of bugs are hard to track down, you want to keep your code simple and readable. But that's just one way if you're concerned about growth of events and scope. Now again, on circle touched, in this case, is here. But watch this. What if I do it here? And I say runtime. Let's go back to the old event. On circle touched. and I say self, right? He can listen to global events as well. Print. Let's say if e.target equals self, then I was touched. So global events are cool in that respect, in that they can listen to themselves as well. Okay. Self at circle. So we say self.name. Right. So the circle knows about global events as well, even the ones that it actually had a hand in dispatching. So runtime's kind of cool in that, but it also leads to a little craziness. Sometimes it's easier to have certain GUI objects, anything that's displayed or seen, and model objects as well. If they dispatch their own events, then you use global events later. But you know, sometimes for smaller games, trying to quick iteration, sometimes runtime's best because it dispatches everywhere. You get the flexibility. So, but just be aware, all the same scope rules apply with, you know, runtime. So you could also say, well, look, I don't have a custom circle, you know, event dispatched, so I want to forward it to on circle touched, circle with the event, right? That's another way we can do it if you don't want to have, you know, circle doing that. Another even stranger thing is you can actually, after you get the instance, redefine the touch. Print. Circle 2's touch. Overrode, forget what it's called. But we can say circle 2. All right, before we touch anything, watch this. See? So to override his touch, right? He already had a touch function, I overrode it. So that's another way you can do it. He automatically listens to it inside, but this is just a quick way to do it as well. So same scope rule, right? He knows that his touch is there. He knows his self is there. So strange, right? You getting it? Okay. So that's basically, I think, it. You could also, I could briefly talk about singletons. Let's talk about a singleton. Let's say, let's make a score model. Score model. Notice I'm not going to make a constructor for it. This is a static class. So let's talk about score static classes first, then we'll talk about. So we'll say add to score. Value is score model dot score equals score model dot score equals value. Okay. And we'll say score model dot score is 100 or 0. Okay. So let's get rid of the global stuff. All we care about right now is the local ones. We'll say self for now. And we'll go to main. Get rid of the overridden one. Get rid of the silly texts because we don't need that. And we'll just use the regular touch listener for now. And say on touch circle. A static class doesn't have a new, it's just a table you start using, right? So we'll go add score 100. Add to score, sorry. Add to score. Okay. Print score model dot score. Now notice I actually use score model to reference the score. I don't use self, right? There is no real knowledge of self because I'm just adding this as a function. I could theoretically go like this, score model dot score, and then say self dot score. If you wanted to, you could do that as well. That's, you know, valid. But then you're forced to actually call it with the actual colon to make sure it has self, right? And that's okay, per se. I mean, you can do that, right? You know, increase the square every time you touch it. But then if you change it back to this, then you're forced to call scope, right? When you actually increment the score. So you have to go like this. And it's just is dumb, right? So I make it a bunch of anonymous functions. It just makes it easier. And it looks easier to read because you're like, all right, score model, this big object equals a function, right? So I like it like that. You don't have to worry about scope. You know it's global. You follow this whole convention of capital case, right? Starts with an S, so it's a class, not a instance. And then you make a dot. Just like similar to how you display dot new circle, right? You don't do a colon new circle, right? So Same result, but it's just a convention, right? It's a way to deal with static classes. So that's a static class. The problem with static classes is that they don't have the ability to create unique instances inside of themselves. They do to a point, but most of the time singletons are, you only get one instance and allows you to do specific cool things that you can do with instances. Because Lua is back and forth, static classes and singletons kind of merge, but you can have the same syntax of this kind of class and make it a singleton, right? So one way of doing that is to change this whole model, score model, new model.score equals 100. Return model function model add to score value. Then you can say self.score equals self.score plus value, right? And then you can say if score model, and we'll put it up here. And I'll say instance just to be correct. I like saying inst, but even an instance, that's fine. If score.model instance equals nil, then I'm not going to enforce it right now, but basically this, and then you can go score model.instance to add a score. So you'd still have to call colon on the instance, but that's somewhat of another way to do it. And there are other examples of better singleton examples than this one, but that's basically how you would do it singleton. You can guarantee you a unique instance. There's ways of enforcing it using local, like you do a local closure in here and ensure that that's passed to constructor. And the only way you could actually do it is if it's a local variable. Now, score model has access to its own local variables, but those outside of the score model closure do not. So that's a way you kind of enforce it. But you know, enforcing singletons like in Lua, like really, just use a static class and call it a day. So that is an example of scope, and I hope that made a lot more sense. If you take a larger example game like Full Dan and Maestro, I'll run through some of this examples of scope here, give you an idea. So things like display and set status bar, that's a static class. Display has all kinds of constructor functions on it. They're more of like factory functions that you pass things and it gives you things back, but there's no real scope on display. The globals that I have are game loop, and I'm very explicit by setting them to G. Game loop, main group, and stage. I also have the underscore version, which is the JavaScript library, which they ported to Lua. Some other globals. I have another global function. You see this doesn't have local. Show props is nice because it'll actually loop through any object and show you the properties. So if you shove underscore G in there, you get some really interesting things. Some common factory functions that anybody wants to use, like creating things. Also the distance formula, very helpful in games. If a number is even or not, very helpful in games. Right, the rest of them are local. These are all basically unit test functions that I can test, so they're all local, so they don't actually affect other classes that are in there, right? And then some of the utilities, like the state machine, he has its own instance. He dispatches groups specifically, and this is something about Lua that helps to know about scope. You can extend a group and not actually show anything. Why would you want to display a group? Because you can do self.dispatch event, right? You can't do that if you're just a normal Lua table. So if I don't like this, I would be forced to use runtime. Not very cool for a state machine when it's a class. You want to create multiple instances of it for a variety of people. You don't want to have all these runtime events going anywhere. Like, I have to query the target all the time. It's just ridiculous, right? So I just, that's one way you can do that. It's something you need to know about scope. Let's see if there's anything else that you need to know about scope that's a little strange. I don't think there's really anything else that would be helpful. Yeah, the sound manager, he's actually a singleton. I actually call init on him. The reason he's a singleton is because I want him to have a variety of functions inside of him that look like this and actually have scope specific, even though there's only ever one instance created, and I like this style of class. So he was a singleton I did to wrap the whole concept of channels versus volume versus streams versus stream sounds, right? And deal with all the audio stuff like that. So that's another example where singletons are actually good. So hopefully that helps you with scope and Lua, brings it a little more clarity if you choose to do classes this particular way. and hopefully gives you a better idea. So again, my name is Jesse Warden. You got any questions, you can hit me up on email, you can hit me up on Twitter, you can hit me on Google+. I'm participating in one game a month, and I encourage you to do so as well. I've been learning a lot, and there's a lot of groups on both Google+ and Twitter. And again, you can comment on a YouTube video. I'm also somewhat responsive from email. I've just been busy the past 2 weeks because of taxes and work and everything else. So hope that helps. And thanks for your time.